Okay, good afternoon. Happy Monday after Thanksgiving. Really appreciate everybody coming out today. I put my phones on stun, so I would encourage you to do likewise because we are filming this, and so that folks that weren't able to come, I'm sure everybody's got very similar questions, so maybe you'll ask a question that will help them out. So, building Bastrop. This all started for us back in August when we did the dreaded, for this audience, M word of a moratorium. And I think we have done actually the opposite of a moratorium, having issued more than 200 permits. When I was a young engineer and growing up, moratorium meant everything stopped everywhere and nothing was going anywhere. So what we were focusing on is we just can't have development that has an adverse impact on our neighbors. That's what we had to put a stop to. As we dug into things, we found out things that probably a lot of folks in this audience already knew. That is, turns out our regulations, not so clear. A lot of bad references, a lot of, would get complaints that you ask 3 people in planning the same question and you would get 3 different answers. And on staff's defense, they could all 3 point to the part of the regulations of why they were answering the question the way that they were. So we have to have a point of, one way that you get out of the hole is you put down the shovel and you quit digging the hole deeper, and that's what we're trying to do. And we need your help because as we build Bastrop, these are the very people in the room that are going to help build Bastrop. And I am very honored, and I guess I should have started with this because I think I know most people, but I'm not sure I know everyone. I'm Connie Schrader, and I'm the mayor. I was elected in May of 2017, so anything before that is BC, before Connie. And our city manager, Linda Umble, joined the city in March of 2017. So anything before March is BL, before Linda. So we need some grace as we move forward and try to pull all of this together. You guys are a very special, you have a different perspective than the citizens that have residents that think, why do I care what's in the building regulations? It doesn't really matter until there's a subdivision being built across the street from me, and I want to know how they were able to do that and what's going on with it. So we have a municipality that we need to take care of. When we talk about fiscal sustainability, I had a conversation with Mr. Jack earlier about we got to take care of our infrastructure. We have to know what you have as we're able to plan and make land use decisions as we move forward. So it's very critical that we get things done correctly. I was quoted in the paper as saying the decisions we'll make in the next few months will influence this community for decades. And that is proof point by the fact that we haven't updated codes since, would y'all tell me, 86 or something like that? A long time ago. So it's not something that's done on a regular basis, so it's really important that we get it right. As a part of getting it right, we are not Moses. We're not coming down with stone tablets, and it's not something that if we make a decision, it's never going to change. We've got to have some flexibility, and we know that, and sometimes the best laid plans ends up with horrible consequences that make things harder on y'all and not what we wanted anyway. So we are more than willing to tweak things. That being said, we've got to have some stability. So we need to have a lot more right and a lot more stable than we have things that we're going to be tweaking. So this conversation today is really intended to be a dialogue to give you guys an opportunity to ask some questions, for us to get some feedback, and to lay the groundwork for our design rodeos that are going to be on Thursday and Friday. I know you guys are busy and may not want to come spend all day Thursday and Friday with us, which was why we wanted to have a very concentrated effort on these specific questions. So with that, thank you very much for showing up. It's great to see everybody. And Linda or Matt, are you going to show us some slides?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Lewis with Simple City Design, and we'll be helping the city facilitate the process for the new development regulations. And before we get started, we're going to have a series of slides to kind of get the conversation kicked off. And again, this is supposed to be a dialogue amongst ourselves to talk about current patterns, current trends, future markets, current markets, those types of things. And this is an effort that we're calling Building Bastrop. And Building Bastrop, as the mayor just noted, was born to create a system based off of honoring the authentic past and planning for the sustainable future of the city. Fiscal sustainability has been a real critical juncture for the city, and it is identified in the comprehensive master plan as something that is really critical to the future generations of this community. Before we get started, I want to just poll the audience real quick. Who is an architect? Engineers? Home builders? What about infill home builders? Small scale? Yeah, small scale builder. What about developers? Any landowners? Landowner? Okay, great. Anyone I missed? Organizations? I see HBA. So, anyone else that we missed? All right, cool. Just wanted to get the general makeup of the room so we can focus the conversations on that. We began this process in July with an extraction of the DNA downtown. We've been studying the physical and numerical makeup of downtown Bastrop to see what type of codes would have governed that type of environment. What are the overall block structures, the lot makeup, how those things interrelate, which I'll go into a little more detail in a second here. We did an infrastructure tour on the 28th of July. August, we did presentations throughout the Planning Commission to the City Council about some of the findings. We started a downtown DNA report, which was submitted in September. Code assessment was also done. We studied the existing land development code, the zoning and subdivision and development standards of the city as they are on the books now, and made some recommendations in a report to the city, which was submitted on the 18th of September. And then we've had some biking tours, some walking tours, really to get down in the physical environment to see what it looks like on the ground, rather than looking at it from a plan view and those types of things, which were really well attended. And then we've done today, we should add this on the agenda, the 26th, we have this today, and then the 29th and 30th, we have the design rodeo. And then December the 13th and 14th, we will have the code rodeo. The design rodeo will be talking about the overall designs of the community that we can go back and write the development standards to code. The code rodeo will be the actual code elements, the language and parameters and standards which make up the development code. That's the overall intent of how this will flow. When we started studying the downtown DNA, it is a series of small blocks, 330 feet by 330 feet, with a variety of internal lot makeup, right? And they're very flexible. They're timeless. They've been here for 186 years now, 186 years now, in the exact same configuration. The public infrastructure has been in the same configuration, but the internal lot makeups and the businesses within the lots have changed and been timeless, flexible, adaptable, yet the overall footprints of the blocks have been in the exact same configuration. And it was a really interesting findings. The current code creates the image very similar to the one up here, with wide street sections, larger signs, the buildings are set back, high parking standards, versus the image on the bottom, which is the traditional street network and a series of blocks. Same types of elements of development, just rearranged, and the characteristics lead to different patterns and different outcomes. We understand that, and here's a real-life example of this. This is an 11-lot block structure, and so you can see here's the overall city block, and there's a new one that was platted into one single lot with a brand new single-user tenant on it with parking and your typical business as usual development regulations. And so what we notice is that the overall developable value per acre is still higher on the old and blighted block than what the new restaurant brought in, and who knows if they got tax incentives and those types of things, but it broke up the block, removed the ability for flexibility, a series of tenants, and the overall value went down. What we're showing here is just patterns of development and the value capture aspects that go along with it. Big box oriented, Home Depot style development, again, about the size of a full city block. You have generally about the same square footage as buildings, but again, they are broken up with a series of networks of streets, a variety of tenants. You have residential units downtown in the downtown grid versus just auto-centric type of development patterns with no units or on the big box. And here's another example as well. This is an example that came from Asheville. Their Walmart consumes 34 acres. Their downtown mixed use is 0.2 acres. The property taxes per acre is $6,500. The downtown, $634,000. Retail taxes per acre, $47,000 for the Walmart, $83,600 for the mixed use building. Residents per acre, 90 residents per acre on the downtown mixed use building. Jobs per acre, 5.9. Downtown mixed use, 73.7. The overall patterns of our development and the regulations which are created are governed by these outcomes. And so today, I wanted to just show what these patterns can have an impact on, both the city's financial budgets, as well as infrastructure, as well as the development community, how this all fits together to create long-term fiscal sustainability. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into the dialogue. And again, this is supposed to be interactive with you all. Bastrop's market today, what's doing great, what's holding it back, what needs improvement from the development community perspective so that we can actually start to ensure that the development regulations that we create are fiscally viable. They will allow for entrepreneurial, interjections into the community. Smaller lot dimensions may allow for different startups. So we're really trying to get input from the development community about the current market, and then we'll go into the future market, as you can see by the agendas. So I'm going to sit down and hopefully we can have a dialogue about this. Scott, Mr. Miller, and I had a long conversation about Bastrop's market. I guess it was a week ago?
Yeah,
about a week ago. And it was a very telling conversation, but I would love to have y'all's input on this as a collective. Scott, I don't know if you want to kick this off with a conversation.
Yeah, so we talked about what Bastrop is, right? I mean, the market's got a ceiling. We know that, and that's some of the things that we're battling against. And this goes into kind of looking at different type of product arrays. So what Matt and I talked about was, allowing the zoning flexible enough. So, for example, if we want to do alley load, and we shrunk the street sections down, drop our costs down, make it viable per acre basis, that product may work. It doesn't work now under the current zoning.
And so what we would love to do is have dialogue about some of the tools that are prohibitive to housing diversity, to the overall construction cost, public infrastructure costs, and how much it's both for infill and greenfield development. It would be great if we could have kind of that dialogue.
Let me put some perspective to why we've gone to fiscal sustainability. The community adopted a comprehensive plan back in November of 2016. And in this, it essentially has some what we call guiding growth principles. And the interesting element to these all lead back to one thing, and that's fiscal sustainability. And so I have an analogy that sometimes as government, the point's to ride the horse, but we write regulations that ensure we fall off the horse to the right. And when we do, we end up writing policies to offset that ensure that we fall off to the left, forgetting that the intent of the exercise is to ride the horse. And so part of what we're challenging, and you've heard the mayor talk about this, is our own paradigms. And I'm saying this because you're not going to hurt our feelings when you say regulations suck. She told you that. So our interest at the end of the day is to figure out what is fiscally sustainable. And hopefully it's flexible and allows the market to be in charge instead of a bookbinder that's 30 some odd years old that's dictating a market that's come and gone. So with that preface, we really are interested in what you have to say because we need to figure out how to do different because what we're doing is not working.
This is going to be a slow meeting at this pace, guys. It really and truly, this needs to be a dialogue. And I mean, we can keep talking to you all, but...
Well, Matt, is the idea to create like a general plan for the city where you start from the core and radiate out, where you start with density in the core, talking about mixed use, retail, and residential uses, and then allowing great flexibility within that downtown core to encourage investment, and then kind of radiate out with lowering the density, ultimately getting out to some sort of rural standard out in the ETJ.
Sure.
Is that the goal of what you guys are doing?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think it's a good conversation starter. The intent is that we're building a community here. This is not about zoning rules. It's not about your overall development standards. This is about a future build out of this city. And how does it look, feel, and function? And is it fiscally sustainable? Did we connect residents to services? Did we provide flexibility in timeless places? Did we build a series of isolated enclaves that are completely disconnected and now blighted that the city's trying to figure out? What are the development tools that can help reduce the risk of bad or poor decisions for the future of this community? That's what we're here to talk about. If we want to go in a sequential order and think about downtown and its timeless efforts and the overall physical makeup which make up downtown, you know, it's an incredible timeless environment. Most American cities in the entire United States started out in the exact same configuration as downtown Bastrop, the American grid. The American grid was the standard of how we built our cities, and it continued out in a timeless manner. Today, the way that our cities are being built by the minimum zoning standards and your minimum subdivision standards. So we're requiring a D-, and we're telling everyone to build a D-, and we're getting a D-, and you can tell. And so the outputs look like that. What if we requested a B+? And what would those development standards look like? And how might those actually benefit the development community for both the long-term interest and the upfront investment they're making, both from the predictability standpoint of what's happening in your neighbor's lot to the long-term build out of the community so that you can actually allow for flexible, adaptable regulations to take place. One of my favorite examples is we are so into coding that we'll write standards just because to write standards, or some negative thing happens, we write a standard to prevent that from happening again, not realizing that we coded out a great ability for creativity to foster. And so Bastrop is the place that is really open to new ideas. And I think that the opportunity that you all are being afforded is absolutely incredible. Then you have leadership like this that's asking for true input into writing the development regulations, and this is your market, this is your wheelhouse. We need some input. Yes, sir.
Well, your word on predictability is an important one for Bastrop. Predictability and resiliency, and starting with the basics. In my short time interacting with Bastrop, we unfortunately had a fire and then the floods and back-to-back years, and the new home stuff that I participate in hasn't been affected by that. But when it rains big and I think, how is Bastrop doing? Or the marketability of the community is that the city that floods? And even though it's been kind of isolated where it's hit, when I was reviewing the code right around the time of the moratorium, you could kind of see where we got to this point there, and that seems like a first step that should be automatic or should have been automatic.
That's great. So overcoming that, the city that floods, you don't want to be known as the city that floods. Helping overcome those types of messages would be critical for this community. And I think that this leadership is absolutely willing to do that. That was really good.
For some of us that are taking notes, can we get your name before you ask your question?
Oh, Madison Inselman.
Yes, sir.
A point on mixed-use development. And this is experience from a couple of towns. I'm a former councilman on a small town that tried to recently do a future land use plan that had mixed use. And in that mixed use was, we mistakenly used the word apartments, which immediately brought out pitchforks from the no-growth group. I know you have your share of that here as well. We don't want any apartments in, and this is the town I was in. How dare you even say that word? So we changed it to medium-density multifamily, and that kind of went through, but it's still a fight to come. In another town my father lives in right now, there is a recall for the mayor because he, in a PD mixed-use development, seems to be in bed with an apartment developer. This is a mixed-use developer who wants to do the apartments first. Just a warning there that developers are slimy people, I am one, I know. And if you're going to allow apartments, that's what's going to get built, and you may never see the retail or the mixed that comes with that. So I don't know, I don't have the answers on how to fix it other than don't use the word apartments when you want to start a problem.
And don't use the word affordable.
An
housing
affordable apartments,
either.
oh my gosh, that's the worst of anything you could say. So.
And it's interesting, requiring mixed use is a difficult thing. You may lock the market up, or, where you may not get the apartments if you dictate that the retail or the services must be built. And so there's a real balance point there that you've got to strike. And I think it's a really good point that you bring up, though. That's great.
For those of you who don't know me or I haven't met yet, my name is Matt Jones. I'm the Director of Community Development, or Planning and Development, sorry. I've been here since September. So I think, sometimes, and what we're doing here in municipalities, sometimes we do a really good job of borrowing from other people. So we take a code that works somewhere and we say, okay, we want to be the next Hutto or whomever. You plug it in, we borrow their code and expect it to work here in Bastrop. So what we're trying to do here is start from literally ground zero. Where are we today? What does our past look like? What's authentic about that? What works? Why is downtown Bastrop after 186 years still going strong versus some other towns who haven't made it? What are those elements? And not necessarily that apartments or anything are a bad thing, but are those sustainable? And we want to create these codes and draft these codes that, whether it be apartments or whether it be a real estate lot, that our code works with all of them. And it's not necessarily what you put into the code, but what do you get on the backside and what does that look like? So I think we're putting a lot of effort onto looking what everything looks like. So things like apartments and things of those negative connotations aren't scary anymore because our code works for all of them. And I think having some flexibility and letting market, to some case, dictate some of that will help. But I think that's where we are from the ground. We're at a blank slate and going through this process. That's why your all's input on this is critical, because you are the ones out there every day looking at land deals, looking at cost evaluations. What do you need in a piece of dirt to make that work? And we want to make sure that we're not just putting in place codes that are just, barriers to that. We want to work with you, and so that's why we're really looking for some input.
Politically, it's pretty easy for me to carry. Not all developers are slimy, just a few of them, right? And I used to be a developer as well, so I have a perspective on that. But I can sell the fact that the developer puts the cost in one time, the city gets to maintain it forever. So we had one development where there was a comment of, well, of course the developer wants you to do that because then they'll have to put in less roads. Well, if you were talking about alley loading and having a little bit smaller width street, well, if that's what you need to make the money deal go together, that's also less pavement that we have to maintain forever. So we're in this together. For us to be able to be successful, you guys need to be successful. So not putting any pressure on anyone in particular, but I'm really interested in hearing from the engineers on what the rules are that when a developer brings you a deal and you're putting a feasibility report together for them, that you think, if they didn't have this stupid rule, we could do this and it would make the numbers work. So that's the kind of input that, and I'm not saying that's the only input, but we can't know that. We know what we inherit, and we're getting pretty good at what that lane mile cost us to maintain, but we need some help on the upfront, how to have smart development that can meet the market demands, but that we can maintain for a long time. So I'm very interested in some suggestions of things that we are asking for that are really dumb, or things that you wish that we would ask for. Yes, sir.
My name is Chris Fields. There was originally some months back, a draft code that was presented. There was some input provided, and you'll have to excuse me if some of my questions or comments have already been addressed, or some of the items have already been removed, because there was some input provided. A couple of things jumped out with regard to that first draft, with regard to maintenance of roadways and streets. It was like 18 inches of concrete pavement over, 12 inches of base. I mean, the example being it was just an exceptionally thick road pavement section, almost highway design. And that, of course, is very cost prohibitive in a neighborhood when you're basically selling homes and have lot values, that it's the residents there that have to absorb that cost. So the city may never have to maintain a highway section, roadway through a neighborhood, but can people actually buy a home in that neighborhood? So there's a balancing point.
Absolutely. There's a
And
happy medium,
There's,
right?
yeah, hopefully happy. But, that was the first rattle out of the can, was just this exorbitant. So I don't know where that came from, but it really rocked a lot of people back on their heels. Another thing that jumped out, it's really nice to have a neighborhood with open space and green belts. Certainly something that's desirable for my developments. I think it's something that's certainly desirable, I would assume, for Bastrop, as far as development in some of the ETJ areas, for example. Everybody likes green belt and open spaces, but one thing that jumped out was a requirement in that draft that the streets, the neighborhood street, be basically 50% loaded, so that houses back on the nice open space and the houses across the street also have at least a front door view of this open space across the street. Well, what you've done there is you've 50% loaded the neighborhood street, so that just doubled the cost of the residents for the streets and utilities that live along that street. Their lots just went up in price because you have fewer homes to share that cost of that roadway and the utilities that run in that street. So there's other ways to do that. If you want views of open spaces, corridor roads where you can't front homes, where you don't actually serve residential lots off of a larger type street that might lead into a community, that's a perfect corridor to enjoy an enhanced park or open space that everybody that comes and goes in and out of that community can share in the look and feel of that open space, and then work their way back into their neighborhood cul-de-sac where they live in their homes. But those were two issues that jumped out at me that were of large concern with regard to cost for future housing.
One comment I would make on green space is when you look at a subdivision, and particularly here in Bastrop, there's a creek around you somewhere, right? And when you guys lay the streets out and you load them with all the lots, and your green space is floodplain on a creek that we can't get to, and the residents think it's going to be this lovely park, I'm not really interested in that green space of maintaining that from a long-term basis. I understand the cost expense of one way, but I just need you guys to understand the leftover floodplain that you can't build on anyway doesn't really satisfy the green space that the residents are looking for. So we got to find something in the middle, and I'm super open to suggestions for that.
Okay, perfect suggestion there. You're referring to what you might end up with a sleaze developer product, where they have no desire to really do any enhancement along that green space. You have in your downtown area a fantastic riverfront area with sidewalk. That's floodplain. Okay. You have a good developer that comes in and has a desire to bring to your community, Bastrop, something that's pleasant like you have in your downtown, that residents and even surrounding neighbors can come and hike and bike along these corridors. That's all part of the development plan, and that's all part of the thought and concept. I'm not one of those developers who just wants to try to get park credit, okay, and just put it back in a corner. We're talking about enhanced communities and something that's actually going to be marketable and something that the city could be proud of and the community can be proud of, because a happy community and people that are proud to live in the community tell their friends, you got to come live in community X because we've got this really cool trail system along this creek in this back area that's accessible. So I understand
accessibility is a big part of it.
That's exactly right. So I understand exactly what you're saying, and I also know exactly what you're referring to as far as a bad land plan or a bad layout and just trying to cut corners and get park credit. That's all can be sorted out in a preliminary plan. First time a developer submits a preliminary plan, a concept plan, that's when those discussions can take place.
What would you recommend from a code standpoint to make sure that we start in that middle area instead of playing the game of we want everything, you want nothing, now we're going to meet in the
Well, that
middle?
gets back to the code where it was already stating very specifically that, hey, all streets have to be 50% loaded. Well, that can be a very, big problem with regard to land planning. Because the terrain here in Bastrop, in a lot of cases, actually dictates the shape and feel of a development of any sort. The block structure you have downtown doesn't work in some of the topography in other parts of the area. So to actually write into a code that you have to have 50% loaded if you have greenbelt, that may not work with a certain plan, and that was actually stipulated black and white. So you've already got a problem there.
So what if we wrote intent statements? Because you're exactly right. One of the challenges we have is we're not very big, and you can go across town and be in 3 different cities before you go from one side to the other. So
Right.
topography really is a challenge.
Correct.
And so one of the things that we recognized right off is we can't take a one-size-fits-all approach to the code
Not
because
in-
it doesn't work.
Not in this town.
That's
One side of town is, and Bastrop is small, by comparison, and it has a whole lot of bang for the buck. As far as, you don't have to go too far to feel like you're in a whole different place. And that's one of the luxuries that Bastrop has. So it's hard to actually write intent because then you get into reviewers in the city actually saying, they're reading between the lines. And you're back in that situation where you have 3 reviewers pointing to a section saying, well, this is the intent. Because, that's hard to interpret. So right off the bat, what we're seeing here is it's very hard to actually write, black and white language. The way you actually arrive at that is still, it's very, I don't want to say simple, but basically it's a park or greenbelt requirement, per unit development. As long as somebody brings you a concept plan that meets those conditions, that's a start. That's a starting point. And that's pretty common for just about, many cities or communities. But it's a starting point. You're not actually stipulating that 50% of your homes have to be able to actually have a front view of a greenbelt lot. That creates the problems.
That's a question. So if you had it, it's black and white, and the way it's written, there's an option for a plan development, right? So that's exactly why I think it's written. The first draft is so strict.
Right.
So that it would move everybody into a plan development where you have to get outside of your box and do just exactly like you're talking, because not everybody wants to do that, which is why the code is so restricted to start.
Completely
Do you think that's
understood.
the way to go, or exit out, or?
Right. If you basically say your concept plan comes in and we expect you to see, we would like to see in Bastrop and our surrounding areas, a certain percentage of open space greenbelt per LUE or whatever type of improvement, then a planner, engineer, developer is going to bring in a concept plan, and right off the bat, you're going to be able to look at their land plan and their layout and see the configuration. How you identify that's not going to work because you don't have accessibility, that could be some discussion in a different part of the code as far as, accessibility standards, just like a lot of cities are looking at, and it was mentioned earlier in some of the other design sessions that have been presented about pedestrian and bicycle access. That's becoming more and more concern. So those can all be considerations that can be identified in basically a planning ordinance. These are the items that we wish planners to take into consideration and present to the city. Bicycle access, pedestrian access, accessibility to the parks and green belts. So right off the bat, you're telling the developers and the land planners what your expectations are. It's not written black and white, but you're explaining to them, when you bring us a plan, this is what we're looking for.
That's great. And so, real quick, we're going to move off the market. Is there anything else on market trends? We expected this to go like really a longer conversation. Then we're going to move in the rules. We kind of are in the rules. Anything else on market?
Got a question?
Oh, yes, sir. You guys want to?
One of the things that we're seeing is the big home builders like KB and DR Horton, they want smaller lot sizes. They're coming to us and saying, we want 40 and 45-foot lots to do a smaller product to kind of fill that market in between apartments and the larger lots that for a lot of people are becoming unaffordable. So my suggestion would be having a couple of different residential zoning districts that allow diversity of lot sizes so that you can accommodate that kind of middle market that a lot of cities are missing right now.
I'd like to follow up on that, also including condominium regimes. If you're not familiar with that, that should also be included in
Freestanding.
zoning.
Right. Although I think most homeowners would always prefer just straight up lots, if we can make that work in some combinations. But it is good to have that option.
To have that available. And again, it
There's
gets
a
back.
market there for that condo. People who don't want to maintain the yard, Right. they want it, looks I'm like a one house, of those they don't want to maintain the yard. Right.
But that's, in the zoning, that's certainly something should be, because again, you get into a situation, topography again is a perfect example, you don't always have the ability to lay out neighborhoods in a certain manner. And so it's nice to have that available, that option available.
So what you're saying is to have smaller lot dimensions available under this single individual lots through platting and by condo regime under one zoning classification, but the lot dimensions would be allowable under multiple financing mechanisms, I guess.
That's
Or
correct.
platting. Okay.
And for attached or detached.
Right.
Single family. So some brownstones, in other words.
Yeah, townhomes, brownstones,
Townhomes,
row
brownstones.
house. Okay.
Are you guys all seeing that in that market for
Yes.
that brownstone kind of thing? Because these millennials, right? What do they want to be when they grow up? Boomers. Will they ever grow up?
I was going to say, I thought.
Yeah.
Well, I actually live in Lyman, so I'm not a millennial.
I'm just, I gave birth to two millennials. I'm still trying to figure them out, and I don't know, I just know they're not living in my house. I just not figured out exactly what kind of house they do eventually want to live in. But I think it's important, I just want to know, from the market standpoint, it feels like there's more of a demand for a variety of housing types than there's ever been before. Am I right in that? I'm
That is
seeing
correct.
nods.
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay.
I think that there are a lot of cities in the Central Texas area that are not far ahead of where y'all are, that are going back, just like you mentioned, who are wishing that they had made those missing middle connections kind of earlier on. So I think it's great that y'all are considering that.
Yes, it is great.
This might segue from market to current rules for you, but the PD, I've always been a big fan of PD zoning because I thought it allowed for creativity until recently when I had a client that was, I was brokering a piece of land and he went through $200,000 worth of beautiful work and it was a listed use for the PD. And it went through planning and zoning with thumbs up and it went to the council and they think, that's not really what we want there. It's $200,000 of a client that is never, ever going to come back to that town. And he'll tell everybody else because he was
You
represented.
need to clarify that did not happen in Bastrop.
I'm not saying, no, it wasn't here.
Okay.
No, it was up in the DFW area. Yeah.
Yeah,
But,
that's a real problem.
I don't know that I like PD so much because of that.
Yeah.
Because unless your council is completely on board with staff and D and Z,
Sure, was set up for it. Did you bring your questions?
Oh, I don't think I gotta know what the questions, I gotta know what
The categories are?
exactly.
Short list. At least y'all were talking. Yeah, we talked on. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, trying to decide what to do. Looking at it.
Okay, good afternoon. Happy Monday after Thanksgiving. Really appreciate everybody coming out today. I put my phones on stun, so I would encourage you to do likewise because we are filming this, and so that folks that weren't able to come, I'm sure everybody's got very similar questions, so maybe you'll ask a question that will help them out. So, building Bastrop. This all started for us back in August when we did the dreaded, for this audience, M word of a moratorium And I think we have done actually the opposite of a moratorium, having issued more than 200 permits. When I was a young engineer and growing up, moratorium meant everything stopped everywhere and nothing was going anywhere. So what we were focusing on is we just can't have development that has an adverse impact on our neighbors. That's what we had to put a stop to. As we dug into things, we found out things that probably a lot of folks in this audience already knew. That is, turns out our regulations, not so clear. A lot of bad references, a lot of, get complaints that you ask 3 people in planning the same question and you would get 3 different answers. And on staff's defense, they could all 3 point to the part of the regulations of why they were answering the question the way that they were. So we have to have a point of, one way that you get out of the hole is you put down the shovel and you quit digging the hole deeper, and that's what we're trying to do. And we need your help because as we build Bastrop, these are the very people in the room that are going to help build Bastrop. And I am very honored, and I guess I should have started with this because I think I know most people, but I'm not sure I know everyone. I'm Connie Schrader, and I'm the mayor. I was elected in May of 2017, so anything before that is BC, before Connie. And our city manager, Linda Umble, joined the city in March of 2017. So anything before March is BL, before Linda. So we need some grace as we move forward and try to pull all of this together. You guys are a very special, you have a different perspective than the citizens that have residents that think, why do I care what's in the building regulations? It doesn't really matter until there's a subdivision being built across the street from me, and I want to know how they were able to do that and what's going on with it. So we have a municipality that we need to take care of. When we talk about fiscal sustainability, I had a conversation with Mr. Jack earlier about we got to take care of our infrastructure. We have to know what you have as we're able to plan and make land use decisions as we move forward. So it's very critical that we get things done correctly. I was quoted in the paper as saying the decisions we'll make in the next few months will influence this community for decades. And that is proof point by the fact that we haven't updated code since, would y'all tell me, 86 or something like that? A long, long, long time ago. So it's not something that's done on a regular basis, so it's really important that we get it right. As a part of getting it right, we are not Moses. We're not coming down with stone tablets, and it's not something that if we make a decision, it's never, never going to change. We've got to have some flexibility, and we know that, and sometimes the best laid plans ends up with horrible consequences that make things harder on y'all and not what we wanted anyway. So we are more than willing to tweak things. That being said, we've got to have some stability. So we need to have a lot more right and a lot more stable than we have things that we're going to be tweaking. So this conversation today is really intended to be a dialogue to give you guys an opportunity to ask some questions, for us to get some feedback, and to lay the groundwork for our design rodeos that are going to be on Thursday and Friday. I know you guys are busy and may not want to come spend all day Thursday and Friday with us, which was why we wanted to have a very concentrated effort on these specific questions. So with that, thank you very much for showing up. It's great to see everybody. And Linda or Matt, are you going to show us some slides?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Lewis with Simple City Design, and we'll be helping the city facilitate the process for the new development regulations. And before we get started, we're going to have a series of slides to kind of get the conversation kicked off. And again, this is supposed to be a dialogue amongst ourselves to talk about current patterns, current trends, future markets, current markets, those types of things. And this is an effort that we're calling Building Bastrop. And Building Bastrop, as the mayor just noted, was born to create a system based off of honoring the authentic past and planning for the sustainable future of the city. Fiscal sustainability has been a real critical juncture for the city, and it is identified in the comprehensive master plan as something that is really critical to the future generations of this community. Before we get started, I want to just poll the audience real quick. Who is an architect? Engineers? Home builders? What about infill home builders? Small scale? Yeah, small scale builder. What about developers? Any landowners? Landowner, okay, great. Anyone I missed? Organizations, I see HBA. So anyone else that we missed? All right, cool. Just wanted to get the general makeup of the room so we can focus the conversations on that. We began this process in July with an extraction of the DNA downtown. We've been studying the physical and numerical makeup of downtown Bastrop to see what type of codes would have governed that type of environment. What are the overall block structures, the lot makeup, how those things interrelate, which I'll go into a little more detail in a second here. We did an infrastructure tour on the 28th of July. August, we did presentations throughout the Planning Commission to the City Council about some of the findings. We started a downtown DNA report, which was submitted in September. Code assessment was also done. We studied the existing land development code, the zoning and subdivision and development standards of the city as they are on the books now, and made some recommendations in a report to the city, which was submitted on the 18th of September. And then we've had some biking tours, some walking tours, really to get down in the physical environment to see what it looks like on the ground, rather than looking at it from a plan view and those types of things, which were really well attended. And then we've done today we should add this on the agenda, the 26th, we have this today, and then the 29th and 30th, we have the design rodeo. And then December the 13th and 14th, we will have the code rodeo. The design rodeo will be talking about the overall designs of the community that we can go back and write the development standards to code. The code rodeo will be the actual code elements, the language and parameters and standards which make up the development code. That's the overall intent of how this will flow. When we started studying the downtown DNA, it is a series of small blocks, 330 feet by 330 feet, with a variety of internal lot makeup, right? And they're very flexible. They're timeless. They've been here for 186 years now, 186 years now, and the exact same configuration. The public infrastructure has been in the same configuration, but the internal lot makeups and the businesses within the lots have changed and been timeless, flexible, adaptable, yet the overall footprints of the blocks have been in the exact same configuration. And it was a really interesting findings. The current code creates the image very similar to the one up here, with wide street sections, larger signs, the buildings are set back, high parking standards, versus the image on the bottom, which is the traditional street network and a series of blocks. Same types of elements of development, just rearranged, and the characteristics lead to different patterns and different outcomes. We understand that, and here's a real-life example of this. This is an 11-lot block structure, and so you can see here's the overall city block, and there's a new one that was platted into one single lot with a brand new single-user tenant on it with parking and your typical business as usual development regulations. And so what we notice is that the overall developable value per acre is still higher on the old and blighted block than what the new restaurant brought in, and who knows if they got tax incentives and those types of things, but it broke up the block, removed the ability for flexibility, a series of tenants, and the overall value went down. What we're showing here is just patterns of development and the value capture aspects that go along with it. Big box oriented, Home Depot style development, again, about the size of a full city block. You have generally about the same square footage as buildings, but again, they are broken up with a series of networks of streets, a variety of tenants. You have residential units downtown in the downtown grid versus just auto-centric type of development patterns with no units or on the big box. And here's another example as well. This is an example that came from Asheville. Their Walmart consumes 34 acres. Their downtown mixed use is 0.2 acres. The property taxes per acre is $6,500. The downtown, $634,000. Retail taxes per acre, $47,000 for the Walmart, $83,600 for the mixed-use building. Residents per acre, 90 residents per acre on the downtown mixed-use building. Jobs per acre, 5.9. Downtown mixed use, 73.7. the overall patterns of our development and the regulations which are created are governed by these outcomes. And so today, I wanted to just show what these patterns can have an impact on, both the city's financial budgets, as well as infrastructure, as well as the development community, how this all fits together to create long-term fiscal sustainability. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into the dialogue. And again, this is supposed to be interactive with you all. Bastrop's market today, what's doing great, what's holding it back, what needs improvement from the development community perspective so that we can actually start to ensure that the development regulations that we create are fiscally viable. They will allow for entrepreneurial, interjections into the community. Smaller lot dimensions may allow for different startups. So we're really trying to get input from the development community about the current market, and then we'll go into the future market, as you can see by the agendas. So I'm going to sit down and hopefully we can have a dialogue about this. Scott, Mr. Miller, and I had a long conversation about Bastrop's market. I guess it was a week ago or so? About a week ago. And it was a very telling conversation, but I would love to have y'all's input on this as a collective. Scott, I don't know if you want to kick this off with a conversation.
Yeah, so we talked about what Bastrop is, right? I mean, the market's got a ceiling. We know that, and that's some of the things that we're battling against. And this goes into kind of looking at different type of product array. So what Matt and I talked about was, allowing the zoning flexible enough. So, for example, if we want to do alley load, and we shrunk the street sections down, drop our costs down, make it viable per acre basis, that product may work. It doesn't work now under the current zoning.
And so what we would love to do is have dialogue about some of the tools that are prohibitive to housing diversity, to the overall construction costs, public infrastructure costs, and how much it's both for infill and greenfield development. It would be great if we could have kind of that dialogue.
Let me put some perspective to why we've gone to fiscal sustainability. The community adopted a comprehensive plan back in November of 2016. And in this, it essentially has some what we call guiding growth principles. And the interesting element to these all lead back to one thing, and that's fiscal sustainability. And so I have an analogy that sometimes as government, the point's to ride the horse, but we write regulations that ensure we fall off the horse to the right. And when we do, we end up writing policies to offset that ensure that we fall off to the left, forgetting that the intent of the exercise is to ride the horse. And so part of what we're challenging, and you've heard the mayor talk about this, is our own paradigms. And I'm saying this because you're not going to hurt our feelings when you say regulations suck. She told you that. So our interest at the end of the day is to figure out what is fiscally sustainable. And hopefully it's flexible and allows the market to be in charge instead of a bookbinder that's 30 some odd years old that's dictating a market that's come and gone. So with that preface, we really are interested in what you have to say because we need to figure out how to do different because what we're doing is not working.
And huge risk, a lot of time, a lot of money. That's true.
I want to kind of echo that because, Trey, I think I heard you say, the regulations, part of it is written kind of strict in order to push you into a PD. Right. From a developer standpoint, when they bring it to me, they're looking, okay, what can I do on this by right?
Right.
And then they look to add betterment, both to their community and to the city they're coming to through that PD process. But what they can do just following the black and white rules, that oftentimes determining whether they're going to come to the city with a PD or not. And if those rules are too hard, they're out because really you go backwards in that process.
So you do the feasibility report and the numbers are so off, you think it's not worth the effort?
Because you go through, when you negotiate a PD, you lose your pound of flesh to staff. Then you lose your pound of flesh to P&Z, and you lose it again to City Council. Everywhere along the way, you give a little bit, and usually you're asking for some things too, so that is a trade-off that's happening. But if that first starting place is too far off the rails, you're never going to get there.
One of the things that we're really striving for, and I will tell you that having done this for almost 30 years, if we're successful, it'll be the first city that I've been in that's been successful. We'd like to operate by right. We'd like to get out of the plan development business. We would like to have the ability to be flexible and allow you the opportunity and responsibility to develop the piece of property that you have to its maximum potential. That's scary for us, probably scary for y'all. It's like making sausage because there's no code for us to go borrow from somebody. So it's not nice, it's not neat, they're not going to be those charts that we know work. So there's going to have to be some grace on all sides. Because what we come up with, I suspect you're not going to find somewhere else. For all of the reasons y'all have mentioned, Bastrop's very unique. Our council has been very, very clear that we're going to honor our authentic past, recognizing the geographical sensitive landscape that we call home. But we also recognize that we need to embrace the future that we have, whether some of us like it or not, because there's always going to be those folks in any community that just don't want to grow. But the truth of the matter is, we all know that we have raised a group of adults now that choice has always been an option and they've never been told no. And I think that's why option now is more critical than ever. So we're going to do something, I hope with y'all's help, that y'all won't have seen somewhere else. And so we want to get out of the plan development business, but how do we write variety in a way that y'all bring us your best work?
So we don't play the
game.
I'm bringing you this because I know I got to give a pound of flesh, so I'm putting extra in. I mean, that just really wastes everybody's time.
So how do we get your best game?
Yes, ma'am.
Didn't Austin put together an overall plan for Central Texas on connecting green space and development?
There, Campo and Capcog, the regional agencies have that, and Austin has the Imagine Austin plan that looks long-term. Yes, ma'am. The Imagine Austin plan looks at it, Austin city limits and ETJ, and it's their comprehensive master plan. And they're going through implementation. You know, they had 8 priorities to implement the plan, and but they did look at the regional connections of it. Yeah.
Years ago.
One note I do want to point out, just regards to PDs, it is the #1 use classification. More acres in Bastrop are zoned PD than any other zoning classification. It's been the predominant zoning classification of choice, other than ag and open space, which is
Have you seen
unzoned.
our regulations?
Yeah, yes, ma'am. Yeah. And so when we talk about predictability and flexibility, one of the things that we have been examining is movable setbacks. And maybe your setback would be 0 to 15, and that would allow for more flexibility of your building envelope to move around on the lot. And particularly when you have smaller lot dimensions, that would be something that we would like to do. And again, this is just conversation starters so that as we go into the design rodeo, we can start thinking about these themes and how to introduce these concepts to the community. This is, again, we're talking about building a community and doing it through a regulatory framework. This is to set the stage for the regulations to foster the long-term community interest and build out. How do we achieve this together where we can get some common sense back into the codes, remove the arbitrary regulations to actually start to incorporate real development standards? I mean, lot dimensions. The minimum lot size here is 7,000 square feet. That's a large lot dimension.
But you said like the flexible building setback. What do you guys think about that?
I was going to say, kind of related to that, it helps the builder when to really kind of spark the creativity to know what the priorities of the city are. So for example, if you're a city and you're concerned about heritage trees, something like allowing flexible setbacks allows the builder to get the product on the ground where the city wants it, but also save the tree. Or if your example about small lot sizes, if affordability is a priority of the city, then obviously smaller lot sizes are going to make that easier for a builder. So, it's almost like what I see in a lot of the cities we work around is everything is a priority. And one of the things I was going to mention about kind of going forward about the future rules is having kind of a hierarchy of code and a hierarchy of priorities. So that way, whenever you're going in and you're building a project, you can say, all right, well, maybe this tree is really, really important. That's, number 1 or 2 on the list, but, make some changes over here that might not be as high of a priority.
I like the hierarchy.
And that goes back to the intent statements. Because the challenge that we've got is how do we guide responsible development that meets the policy when every development's different? So the intent statements, I think, give clarity relative to the expectation of the community. And then you have a responsibility as a developer in that initial meeting when you bring your site plan in, is to tell us how you met the intent, given the opportunities or restrictions, depending on how you view the property you're developing, that could really become assets or liabilities. And then I think the words the mayor used are phenomenally important, is let's put some common sense back in this.
On that, with intent, it's a soft and fuzzy word. So if we bring that, so we go back to the example of there spending all the money to bring a plan in. If you come in with a plan, meet with city staff and say, look, here are all the things I've done. I've managed to, preserve some open space that has access and is actually usable. I've done these things. Does that meet the intent? Is that nodded, and I know the answer to this, that's what I'm asking, is that nodded ahead by city staff binding on the city to approve that? Or is it you're going to go down the road and someone's going to decide, no, I don't like this project, so I don't think you
Let me explain operations and policy. We don't vote.
No.
And there lies the challenge. The key, though, I think, and I think you'll find this in Bastrop, is there is alignment between policy and operations. Because we've spent time having public conversations. This morning, we did a mobility tour. We've engaged the aspect of our community that are in a wheelchair. And we're reading on Facebook, they can't get around. So we went and followed her around. She's right, she can. So we are all on the same page because we are looking at a way to challenge what we've all been comfortable with. And Trey Jobe, who's our Public Works Director, and I spend a lot of time challenging our paradigms on city streets. Well, why do they have to be that wide? Why do we have to have a base that deep? Well, he's going to tell you because they're easier to maintain. Well, if they impede the very development that you need, does it matter how deep the streets are? And what I find is that sometimes we've created these onerous burdens. But all we can do as staff is have conversations. The one thing that I will tell you here that we will do is anytime we get something that staff thinks is odd, out of the box, or futuristic, we're going to workshop that before you spend a ton of money. So we're going to put you in front of the people, and we've got Councilmember Bill Peterson here as well. We're going to give them an opportunity to engage with you before you spend 6 figures to get to that ultimate vote. And they go, yeah, you're kind of short. We like 50% of it, but that other 50, which is the most expensive part of it, you get to go redo. So part of that is just a common sense approach and a commitment to you, the developer, that we're in this together, that we're not out to screw you. It takes you to build a good product. We need you to have a great community. And then with time, it's trust. We have to deliver on what we say. But at the end of the day, staff doesn't vote. And every May, we get new policy. And y'all been doing this a long time, so y'all know that's the reality. But we can figure out some ways to help y'all with the process, because it's not lost on any of us that when we adopt these codes, there's got to be a leap of faith. And somebody has to be first. And who's going to be that person to step up and be first?
So back to the flexible setbacks, my thought is, with developments in general, I think one of the most important aspects is time for a developer. And I wonder, my concern, I love the idea of being flexible because, I'm an engineer and site development permits are what we do. And a lot of times it gets frustrating not being able to have that flexibility. We have a lot of work in Austin, but at the same time, I wonder if y'all implement all this, the ability to be flexible with, variable setbacks and all these different regulations that, okay, it's project by project. When you get an influx of projects, a ton of different projects, and you're trying to be flexible on all these things, I feel like that would take up more of the city's time on all these different projects. And I feel like it would kind of create more of a backlog on y'all's end and be difficult to.
So you think there's a burden on staff to interpret the rules if they're that fuzzy? Is that what you're trying
I
to say?
think so.
I think to counter that, we're already doing that with the plan development.
Yeah.
So we have the most plan developments per zoning out of any zoning category, and they're all different. And we're doing that right now. And then we're coming back in and reviewing it again when the building permit comes in. So we're doing that work today. It's just we're doing it out of a more of a necessity and not building a future. So we're doing the work twice as it sits today. And as long as the codes are clear, it's just reviewing the project, which we do anyways.
Right.
Tracy, I was thinking from your perspective, maybe it's a matter of, since we have so many PDs, if there's things that consistently are in the PDs, put that in the code so that you get some of that by right and you're not wondering if you're going to be able to get that approved. Because I'm thinking, when I was a design engineer, if it's too flexible, I don't know what to tell the developer they can do with that piece of property. I mean, it's kind of the be careful what you wish for, because in trying to make it easier, we may actually be making it more complicated. Do you have a thought on that?
No, it's very possible. Needs some kind of skeleton to go against, something or other.
I really do like the priorities and a hierarchy of priorities, because everything's a trade-off, right? And so if we can agree, everything can't be the priority. We've got to have some, and if we can have levels, would that be helpful from intent statements?
I think it's helpful. I'm a big fan, and I know this is the engineer coming out. I'm a big fan of scoring matrices and assigning things to points. For instance, open space.
I like that.
Okay, green belt, how many points it gets? Is it accessible? Are there portions of it that are flat enough they're going to be able to get a pedestrian or bicycle path through it? Are there parts of it that are, and I understand exactly what you're saying about floodplain. If your green belt is this little creek that every time there's a 2-inch rainfall is bank full with water, that didn't have a whole lot of use. We've got a tremendous amount of Colorado River floodplain here and other that it hasn't flooded and it has not been that high in 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
And those make great soccer fields and ball fields and great open space. So you can find ways to score these things and assign points for them, but then go, okay, if your project gets from 1 to 20, you haven't made the bar yet. If you get 20 to 30, you're subjective approval. Above 30, your parks are good. You can come up with, and you can take down other pieces of the development that way.
Performance zoning.
Anybody think they got problems with that? Or does
There's
that seem-
actually a city that uses a system like that I've developed in for.
And you like it or you don't like it?
It wasn't on an overall development scheme, but they were applying it to connectivity of streets. They wanted to enhance the connectivity as far as street layout and planning, and they established a point system. And it seemed to work okay. The problem was it turned out it pretty quickly ended up in almost forcing a grid type system, because you get points for higher points for a four-way intersection. You get less points for a three-way, less points for a one-service cul-de-sac. And pretty quickly, it got to a point where if you had an odd-shaped piece of land that forced you to use a lot of cul-de-sacs, for example, you'd bring the plan to them, and you'd realize you didn't even come close to the points that they were seeing, but it's because of the topography or the land configuration. So that needs to be taken into account as well. That only had to do with street layout. as far as connectivity. What's being suggested here actually could work overall, and that's a good way to actually identify, like a point system. It gives the developer an opportunity to go, okay, generally speaking, that's a good way to lay out intent. And a developer can actually go through and pretty quickly add up the points and say, hey, it looks like we're meeting the intent, the things that they want to see based on the point score system. Is an excellent idea for an overall planning.
So maybe you're
approach.
not scoring so well on street connectivity, but you hit it out of the ballpark with parks, and ultimately,
And that gives some flexibility for different types of land configuration, different types of topography that you may be faced with. And a developer can actually, or a planner can actually look through that system and actually know pretty well, hey, it looks like this concept plan that we have here actually is going to score pretty well in enough areas that we feel comfortable presenting it to staff.
And that also, I think, gets to your point, that gives the staff coverage, because when the policymaker who doesn't like it, because I keep telling them we don't regulate ugly, the fact you don't like it doesn't mean it's a violation of code, it just means you don't like it. But that gives staff coverage, because if you meet the points, then you had to meet enough of the intents to meet the community expectation for the development.
And it doesn't mean you won't ever have PDs, you won't ever ask for
Right.
variances. It just gives enough to not be so rigid in the code, but be able to establish that intent and still not, okay, by right, I can do.
Metrics that are being used in the matrix are as quantitative as possible and less qualitative. I think that would be, the devil will be in the details when it comes to that matrix, but definitely quantitative.
One of the things that we are getting better at is there's certain things that we take to council every year and get them to review, so that every time we have an election, I get 6 people that say, yep, we can support these policies. That this table, whatever it is, this matrix, would be one of those things annually we would wag out, dust off, and make sure that council still supports that. And if there's a hitch in the giddy-up, then hopefully we would figure that out before somebody brought in a matrix that works but we don't like, and it turns to sand. That's right.
yeah. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I'd like to get back to the variable setback
Yeah.
that was being referred to. I have done deals in south of Houston that have had that also. I think Leander, I encountered a situation like that. It actually works okay. I wouldn't try to, I would leave that in a situation where it would be an option. If a developer has a situation where he'd like to maybe come in with a different feel for community, but when you start actually trying to stipulate every third lot has to have this depth of setback.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think that's what we're trying to
I think
accomplish.
flexible,
Well, I can tell you that became a problem pretty quick.
yeah, I can see that with you.
I think the flexibility is in the flexibility of the different types that you can use in the same zone, if that works. So you might have the same zoning and you might have a 0 lot line or something right up against the street,
Right.
and then have the flexibility to have a 15-foot.
Right.
Because it's very common in PDs now.
Save a tree.
Yeah, you say every other house has to have a recessed garage, or you can't have the same elevation for, 3 houses on the same side. So you're not really accomplishing anything. But I think the flexibility in having true different streetscapes is the intent. Get back to that word, the intent
Yeah.
behind it, not forcing somebody to, set back a garage every 10th lot.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to make clear.
Yes, sir.
Is that I have been in a situation where your garage has to be set back 2.7 feet from the front door on every
You
third
just slap an
house.
overhang over it and call
Yeah,
it good, right?
exactly. And the
I
city
think that's
was-
the things
the
we're
city
trying
was
to get
stipulating
away
that.
from.
And it's like, oh my God, this is almost impossible to plan for, and it was very difficult for my builders to figure out how to actually market and sell a lot. And they're telling, it was very, very complicated. It became quite frustrating. So the option to do variable setback actually helps the builder and helps us a lot in that regard when we have situations like wanting to save some trees on some lots. It's a big benefit. One way that we were able to work around that was not so much focus on the front setback as identify maybe what might be an acceptable rear yard, more so than what's happening in front of the house. What's reasonable as far as a rear yard distance off the back property line. Because you start getting into that situation where you have abutting homes behind each other, really kind of maybe getting too close. So that also was a consideration.
Speaking of rear yards, why don't you talk about alleys? Let's talk about alleys.
I would love to talk about alleys. That was one of the things that jumped out as a concern, because the way the original draft was written, it almost sounded as though there was going to be a mandate in a certain multi-phase development of X number of alley load homes. And it caused my heart to skip a beat or two.
So you like them, you hate them?
They're very expensive. You're paying for twice the streets.
And not only that, it's a cost more, but you lose, the buyer loses less home. They have less home, they have a smaller yard, a smaller home, and so they get less from it too. And one of the things that I've run into with cities a little bit larger than Bastrop is there a demand for it? And the answer is typically no. I think that there are people who enjoy the convenience of driving up to the front of their home. And I guess usually where I see alley loads come into play, I haven't seen a lot of consumer data or feedback that's indicated that's something that the market wants.
So how about other people in the market? Alleys, yes, no?
I guess, David, it depends on the price. You know, if we can drop the cost of development down, deliver the price point, then I think the demand will be there. I've talked to a couple builders that would be willing to come to town to do alley though, but the issue became that it landed on the cost of too expensive. And so going with a full city street section out front, and then a 20-foot alley in the back, and all the drainage, and I mean, it's effectively building two streets, it just became cost prohibitive. That market is there, I think, but we got to be able to drive the lane. So talking about 12-foot alley section, choking down the main street, right, so we can reduce those development costs, then they make it a viable product. But you know, you look at Blanco Vista, and you look at what Paysetter's done there with all of that variety of product, and they're doing extremely well. And I've talked to Paysetter specifically about bringing that type of product, and they would bring it to town. It's just got to be viable from a development.
So a 12-foot alley, and how big's the street in front to make the price point?
Depends on what we want to do with parking, you know.
You can do a rear street, or you change the dimension of the alleys to where you pull the garages in a little bit, which is going to make your lot dimensions a little bit deeper. You go maybe 120.
And then, you know, hand in hand with that is not only we have the cost of development, but then we also have the issue of having a sub-association, right? So increasing our dues. So the second part of the equation is the city willing to come in and maintain those, both the alleys and the streets as public improvement, which helps us then alleviate, have a sub-association, and continues to drop our affordability.
Well, and the sub-associations work the first time, but the second reiteration, they become code enforcement nightmares, because then the sub-associations don't tend to it, and they start showing up at council demanding that the city take care of it, and we can't, and it's just, long-term, they don't always work out well.
Right.
They come and tell us that the realtor promised them that we would take care of it.
Yeah, it definitely needs to be something that's agreed upon up front.
Yeah.
And I think on the 40-foot, just to close the loop on that, on the 40-foot product, you know, our project is, you know, we have a lot of 40-foot product, and it's a very, the way our setbacks are set up at 20 and 25 feet, it's a very garage-dominated product. And so, you know, honestly, you drive a long section of street, and it's garage-dominated, right? It is what it is. But, you know, if we had the ability to have variable setbacks where you could pull the front of the house up 10 feet, and set the garage in the back, you know, we can still create a much superior streetscape, right? And actually, that product is really interesting when you think about gating off that driveway, because if you've got young kids, they have the ability to play in the driveway. Mom's out there with dad, cooking in the kitchen, looking out into the driveway, and the kids are out there playing basketball and all that. So I think, you know, having that ability to plot that under a variable set, one will make our street scenes, would make my street scenes look far better. Would widen the buyer pool, widen the builder pool, hasten my absorption, better for me, helps my underwriting, helps me pay for land.
And that actually produces a nice looking community. And in a situation like that, what I had was if a It's tough to plat because plats usually need to identify, but I'm trying to remember how this happened. I think the builder came in and actually permitted a building plan that actually had a setback garage. They were allowed a variance to actually place the home at 10 foot rather than the 20 or 25 foot. If I remember correctly, we platted everything at 20-foot frontage, but the builder could request a variance for that. I don't know how that worked in the city. That wasn't my world to actually pull the building permits. Somehow they were able to do that. And actually, it ended up pretty neat because it allowed them an opportunity to sell an entirely different product than what they might otherwise be forced to sell.
I really like the idea of doing that. It seems like it gives you some more flexibility, and then it doesn't have to be an alley, and that longer driveway can afford a parking spot that's
Yep.
not
Yep.
in front of the house.
It's a much different
But
look.
that's the issue with that's the other issue with 40-foot, we've got it currently contemplated, it's over park, right? We don't have that much frontage for parking, so that always becomes an issue. But by having one or two deep set garages, you allow them to have, more parking on site.
And if the lots are backing up to each other, if the garages are up close,
That's not an
no one
issue.
cares,
That's
right? I mean, that's different than
That's
I
right.
can see in your kitchen, that kind of.
That's
Right.
correct.
Does anybody not think that's a good idea?
I had something else to add.
Everybody,
We did an attached layout recently for attached homes on very narrow 30-foot, 25, 30-foot lots. And the deep, same thing, driveway loaded from an alley with no road in the front. But there was some common area parking. So all the front doors opened into green space, not into a street.
And they probably sold at a premium.
We're just in the layout stage yet, but I think it's going to be a great idea.
Yeah, it's worked really well. In one of my previous jobs, we actually worked with the fire department. At first, they didn't have street access, and they were concerned. We did dry standpipes along the frontage of those greenways, and they can charge they had two hydrants at the end of the street. They can charge the line and fight the fire without getting the trucks actually into the streets. And they preferred it, and so it actually lowered the cost for the developers as well, because you put dry standpipe out front, underground, and it provides access to battle fires. So it's a really unique way of doing it. So, and these are types of things that we can write development standards around, is we can code this stuff in as viable housing options and products.
then that helps you, doesn't it, Tracy? If those are a by right way to be able to do it.
You have a
Yes, sir.
Well, that's what I was going to say with fire, is it's always important, because fire code dictates a lot of those components as well. In some cities we work in, the fire marshal is very strict, and you have to go by 2012 IFC, you can't deviate. Some of them are a lot more lenient and allow us to do a 20-foot road section with bump outs at the fire hydrants to get their 26-foot. Some are saying, no, you have to 26 foot of pavement for the entire subdivision. So having that conversation with your fire plan reviewer is really important too.
Absolutely. Jeff?
Heard a lot of interesting ideas this afternoon. Most of them are very reasonable and applicable to new construction. My concern is, how do they affect existing neighborhoods? In other words, are you looking at the code for new construction or infill construction?
Both.
If you're looking at infill construction as part of the same conversation, then you need to go back to the community and see if the community is okay with the changes. Because if they're not, they're going to be at the Board of Adjustment looking for that intent statement from here on out.
Well, that's a great point. And what I was thinking about is some of the things that we're talking about is what it looks like in downtown Bastrop. There's a lot of homes, there are a lot of lots that have varying lot widths and have a big house and have a guest house and have a garage that's, an ancillary building that's set back pretty far. And it may be a garage, it may be an apartment, but I was thinking some of the even streetscape that we're talking about would blend in quite well with some of our existing neighborhoods. Yes, sir.
You have to realize that the people that bought into those older neighborhoods had an intent of the lifestyle.
Yes, sir.
That if you come in later and change all the gaming rules, they're going to be upset. It's not that they don't want growth and development to occur. They would like to see it happen in the places that these people generally build and accept those smaller lots and those flexible setbacks and stuff like that. But when it's next door to them, they were expecting the privacy in their backyard, and if that goes away, they got a problem.
Sure, I understand.
Doesn't our form-based code right now protect that? Are you rolling the form-based code into this coding, or are you keeping those separate?
We're examining, and the updates will be rolled into it. Yes, sir. So we've been stuck on this slide for quite a while, even though we're well past it. The next slide that we were going to discuss was the current process. You know, pros, is it under construction? Is it just flowing through? Any process comments as we go through this? We'll be rewriting the development process and aligning staff roles and the overall development code to ensure that you know, the handoff from each staff member is logical and consistent, that the overall development process is fluid and, and predictable. So what about procedural questions?
I'd like to ask an expectation question. You've turned in your preliminary plat. How long, what is a reasonable amount of time from turning in the preliminary plat to starting construction on the project?
Does this preliminary plat have like all the, like a
It's-
official great submittal? Because I'll tell you, most staff members will say,
These people only submit great
Okay.
stuff.
So,
So
a
that
flawless
goes without
submittal.
saying.
All right, that's
That
great.
goes without saying, because the intention is that we've written rules that are clear and people are following those clear rules. I'm trying to get a feel for if we think 90 days is reasonable and you guys you're killing me for anything over 30, you know, that's the conversation I want to have. So what is your reasonable expectation?
Depends on how well you staff your staff.
No. I'll control that
So-
part. What's a reasonable expectation?
One of the biggest holdups that we're having, right, is we have to have the plat approved by city council before we can start construction.
Mm-hmm.
And that usually causes us a month.
But you know what, the
At
truth
least.
is, council meets twice a month and P&Z meets once. So sometimes you could have, there's been a council meeting, but so I don't think you're waiting on council because you're never waiting on us. You're waiting on
Just to get
P&Z.
agendized, because when we're ready to
Yes.
go, we're ready to go. So it always seems like it takes probably on average about 3 weeks longer. The plant check process, I think, in my opinion, has been fantastic
Okay.
with the city. I haven't had, I don't know what your issues are, Doug. chime
And
in here.
what are you guys seeing, Doug? Are you seeing about, how long?
It can vary. I mean, right now, 4 weeks,
4 weeks?
5 weeks,
Month-ish?
month-ish.
Do you guys agree with that, Matt? Do you have a feel for about how long plan review's taken?
I mean, I've been here a couple months, so I haven't had one from the start to beginning, but.
45-ish
generally
days,
speaking,
does that sound?
For a plat, are you talking about plat or construction plans? Or are we
I think he's on
interchanging the
construction
two?
plans.
I'm talking about plans.
Is
Yeah,
that
I
to clear
mean-
for comments?
No, to sometimes receive comments.
Oh, wow.
So we get-
Well,
I think we
my
go-
expectation was 30 days.
Yeah, we get back, we're inside 30 days.
Comments in 30
Yes,
days?
and then it gets-
We're
it gets back
getting
to
it
the
done in
legend,
45? Okay, so, but it sounds like maybe one of the things we need to consider is either having planning and zoning maybe meet more often or look at, it still kind of kills me that if the plat meets everything and you don't have the ability to say no while you're waiting 2 months
Right.
for someone to
Just
say
to get
yes.
agendized.
Well, and a lot
Yeah,
of
so-
places will issue an early grading permit or let you start construction because
That's what I was
if
thinking.
engineering has approved the construction
That's right.
plans and you're just waiting on the ministerial process of approving the plat,
Or
what?
can the council relinquish approval to the planning commission?
I was about to say that I've had jurisdictions where all plat permitting was through the planning and zoning, and
Because-
council relinquished authority to that. And it actually worked out, that I enjoyed developing in that community.
And that's a that's a policy question. We too believe that question should be asked. You know, would council be willing to let the planning commission make the call? You have statutory requirements in your plats. If they meet the statutory requirements, the planning commission should have the ability to do it. That could cut the 30 days.
Would you want to be able to appeal to council if they told you no? Or would
Always,
you?
yeah.
Bring it on. But
Or
that-
you have to appeal to the Board of Adjustment.
Yeah.
There's some state law stuff in there about how you appeal a zoning denial. May have to.
But plat,
This would be
you can appeal to plat to council.
Plat, not a zoning.
What's
Okay,
best
yeah,
required?
you're right. Right.
What do you require to go to final plat?
Yeah, they come to us,
And-
council.
And with full architectural drawings?
I don't think so.
Well,
No.
Horizontal.
Just horizontal?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm in some towns where we've got to go full architectural plans before final, before recording the plat. I can go to final plat with construction drawings, full construction set. But I can't go to a recorded plat until the final architecture has been completed.
No, you don't have that.
We're begging for plats to be recorded around here. We've got problems with lots that are not recorded. Yes, sir.
And this commercial.
I have a plat that's trying to get recorded, and was told that we have to have a pre-construction meeting to have the plat approved. And there's no development plan for the piece of property at all. We're just trying to get it replatted so that we can consider redevelopment. But we happen to have a pre-con meeting.
But it's just a replat?
What's the name of the subdivision?
It's 306 Industrial.
It's the pre-application process right now for the
For the
moratorium.
moratorium.
Oh, so it's not a pre-con, it's a,
It's a pre-application.
Why do we have to have that if it's just a plat?
Temporary process that's
It's
set
it's
up.
moratorium, but honestly, from my experience here, a lot of, especially the smaller infill projects, do not always come in with all the pieces, which then holds up the review process quite a while because staff has to hold plats waiting for other pieces of information that weren't submitted.
Is this typical though, or is this just under moratorium?
Just under moratorium, it was not in the rules before. No.
It's just a temporary.
but before, when we weren't doing the pre-app meeting, it just took forever because you were getting it a piece at a time, right?
A lot of times, yeah.
So with the pre-app meeting, if you've got all your stuff, it should go rather quickly. Is that correct, Jennifer? That's the intent, right?
Yes.
So your meeting's tomorrow? Let me know how it goes.
One meeting, this is on a different project.
Okay.
We're discussing processes here. I'd like to talk about the end of development and the acceptance of a development where, utilities and streets are going in. Infrastructure, right. One thing that I've run into, it's very different depending on the city or jurisdiction that if y'all are considering rewriting the rules. The earlier I can have builders pull a construction permit, the better. The worst situation I found myself in was a city that would not issue a building permit until the street lights worked. And that was a complete nightmare because
Yeah, we don't do that.
I'm just making
Yeah,
aware.
we don't want to do that nightmare.
Yeah,
We
it
won't
was
do that.
forward. And I couldn't convince the city that the builders don't need electricity to do what they need to do. It's not a safety issue. They're not out there working at night. So it was a problem. So the earlier in the acceptance process that my builders can pull a permit and get started with their work, the earliest I believe in most situations I've been able to have a builder pull a permit. Actually, this not in this particular area, but and it's getting away from this, but where we had all-weather road surfaces where a fire truck can get in, which basically was, crushed limestone base that a fire truck could drive over, builders could actually start doing some of their foundation work and even go vertical. They could go vertical if the water system was in place and operational.
Not necessarily accepted, but
Not
operational.
accepted, but operational, meaning it's been pressurized, the hydrants were shown to have been functioning, but it's not accepted.
So
But
Do you remember the comment I made about falling off the horse to the right when we need to ride the horse? It's been my experience, anytime I go into a city and I find that anomaly, somewhere they had to go in and put in streetlights. So rather than understanding that was the first time in the history of that community, they'd ever done that. By God, they wrote a rule, they were never going to do
that
it
again.
again. That's falling off to the horse on the left. So I appreciate that example.
And I
We're
know
good at that.
no builders in here would ever do that. The bigger nightmare is there are some builders that tear up the streets that you just paved, and then
Well,
they leave with the
That's a normal.
dent, and is that now the city's pothole or the developer's pothole?
That falls into
And-
the warranty period typically, and the
Yeah,
developer
but
has.
that's, to your point of, let them get in and do some of their stuff before you've put the final course of asphalt down.
And even following up further, if we can get them going on their models
Yep,
before with just basic, so if you got, this is a big departure from where you guys are going. I'm gonna ask you the same favor. I'd love to have this ability, but in the absence of that, to at least get them to go out and be able to do their models under a TUP, even maybe before the plat's recorded, under a TUP or a CUP, so they can get going, so those models can come out of the ground and get completed as we complete our horizontal improvements. So
What if
these
we
things
all
don't
had
happen.
an agreement with the city that spelled that out prior to construction, a developer's agreement that said prior to, at substantial completion, and we define what substantial completion is, you get 10% of your lots.
I have
And then
had
once
such an
you hit-
agreement, and as far as early models, I was able to have one city agree that at substantial completion, it was defined what substantial completion was. Models we started, the stipulation on the models was there was never going to be a CO
That's right.
issued on the model.
oh, yeah.
That's right.
So, and I tried to explain to this particular city that required the seat lines, I said, look, we're not asking for you to issue a CO, just the building permit. Well, we can't issue a building permit unless we know that we can issue a CO. And I'm like, that's just ludicrous.
Had you posted fiscal surety at this point?
Absolutely.
Is it like
Oh, not just that, 200% fiscal.
Holy cow.
Yeah, but they still live there.
Well,
That's
there's
the
no
key.
doubt.
What I mean by that is, I had to, of course, pay for the infrastructure, put up 100% fiscal, and once it was complete, they kept my fiscal. I was already out that. They would not release my fiscal until, full project acceptance. So, I'm out 200% myself. It was.
You're going to like it in Bastrop.
So I'm just sharing this, just to let you know
No, that's-
what was a horrid nightmare. And if, the earlier I can get builder's permits, the better.
What about some of you guys that do the infill development? What are you bumping into that you think is silly and we should change?
Yeah, what he brought up earlier about the infield part, we're definitely looking at drainage now. When you start looking at infield, drainage is going to be an issue, right off the bat. So I'm glad you brought that up, so that's something that we really have to look at closely when we start doing it.
That's Councilman Bill Peterson, and in the back, we've got Mayor Pro Tem Lyle Nelson has joined us as well.
They vote. Be nice to them.
On the drainage criteria,
Mhm.
hasn't really been anything concrete to look at. Who's actually writing that?
Atlas 14.
I'm aware of that, and one thing I'm particularly concerned about, and this kind of dovetails in with another point, so I'll mash it all together. I've volunteered on groups several times to help look at ordinances and sound technical committees dealing with exactly that, drainage. And one problem that we had, and I think the developers in the room are going to echo this, having been part of code rewrites before, is being involved in the process, feeling like we were heard, and then a long series of public involvement stuff going on, and they layer in a lot of things that this sounds good, and this sounds good, and this sounds good. Everything sounded good, but by the end, you had something that was completely unworkable. And so I have, one kind of lesson learned advice there that it really at the end needs to come back to the technical and to the application. It's good to have developer input and engineering input early. It needs to come on the very back end too about, hey, because you can get a lot of well-intentioned and well-meaning comments from the public, and they will be things that sound very, very good. But when you stack them together, is it still workable?
So let's talk about our drainage process. First of all, we're not going to be rewriting. We're going to trash what we have and start over.
Appropriate.
So there will be no rewriting going on. Let me be clear with that. We have two engineering firms working with us. Half has studied drainage in Bastrop and did a 1D model that was part of the Bastrop County drainage study. We have hired them to come back and build a 2D model on Gills Branch. That is a challenge for us for a number of reasons. In order to answer the question, I have to define geographically our challenge so that you can appreciate the process that's going to come from this. We clearly are in a bowl, and so depending on where you are, perhaps you're building in the Houston Toad area, or maybe you're in the historical district where renovation is, or restoration is key, or maybe you've crossed over to the river where it gets flat and it's just clay. You won't address drainage the same in any of those. So Strand and Associates, we sent out a request for qualifications, and we were expecting 15 or 20 engineering firms. We had 49 submittals. So we ended up interviewing about half of those. And the gentleman from Strand got it because it was easy, it was clear. In my blindness, I could understand it. The challenge we have is not you, it is our community who has flooded not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times. So I appreciate you worry about us because every time it rains here, we have post-traumatic stress. So part of the challenge we have to do is take our community on a journey. And we have to define what fixed looks like. Because some streets are built to be a drainage way, but they'll call us because they're flooding because their street now has water. Well, the comment is, does your house? Well, no, then it's working. So part of that is we as a community have to understand what fixed looks like. So don't be put off when there's public hearings because the journey is the community's to take. The second challenge we have is most of our lots downtown are lots of record. They never go through the development process, the platting process, which is where you would engage with us relative to drainage regulations. So as a lot of record, we now have to put drainage standards in our building development code, which is not necessarily where you find them. When you leave the donut ring that's being developed with the subdivisions and the platting process and you get into the ETJ, we're back to lots of record. And so you manage that through stormwater management. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach for a community that has 4 or 5 different geographically sensitive soil conditions. Oh, and then you have drainage impediments like railroads that divide your community and act as dams. And so you add Atlas 14 that impacts the creeks but not the Colorado River. So it's very challenging. And so we have, we're going to count on half to do their calculation and their modeling work. We've hired Strand. They're a small firm if you don't know who they are. They have an office in Brenham and one in Wisconsin. And the gentleman that's going to be working with us in all of the years, as I said, he gets it in a very layperson perspective. He's interested in charts, that this is your soil condition, this is what you do. So it's a very smart way to develop. Our challenge is educating the community that regardless of what we do, regardless of what our standards are, guess what? We're going to flood again. And that's a very difficult thing for citizens that have post-traumatic stress to own and accept. So I will tell you, there's no reason for us to not come back to you and bring those drainage standards, but we can't deny the community the journey. So it's going to be arduous by design because we need them to come to the table and learn. We need them to help understand what fixed looks like and find something that's reasonable, that works, not only for you, but is sustainable, because whatever you put in, we have to maintain. And we've really got more than we can maintain today. So we'll take that same process the same way, but it's going to be making sausage. And y'all are going to watch this on TV and think, my God, those folks have lost their mind. But hopefully, when we get it all back in the box, we can do something that works.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think more what he was referring to is like a testing group once it's all put together. I think that I've worked in 2 communities now who've done substantial rewrites to their code. One had a testing group made up of engineers and developers to kind of take some case examples and test it. And I worked in another community that didn't have that, and one passed and one failed. So I think bringing it back to the folks who are going to be using it is
We're going to take that one step further. We have an engineer firm.
It's Doug.
Yes.
Doug's firm, and I don't know if you know this or not, but Charles agreed, and one of the things that we were going to do right off the bat was once we come up with a set of rules, take a piece of property and do this is what it would have cost under the old rules, this is what it's going to cost under the new rules, what works and what doesn't work, and do that on, and Charles was like, I'm going to have to do that anyway, because my developers are going to come to me and say, okay, what can I do now that they've got a new set of rules? So we're wanting to make that a part of the process before we do the formal adoption. So it sounds like sounds like an agreeable.
We actually have a timeline, and the same time that council and the planning commission get the codes, it's going to the engineering firm to get that realistic review as a part of what comes to planning and zoning and council, because we don't want to do that after the fact where they have to go and amend. So it'll actually be a part of the review process in hopes that they'll make a presentation and help planning and zoning as well as council make an informed decision about what it is we're really doing, not what we hope we're doing.
And understand what the trade-offs are.
That's right.
You know, and what has worked and what hasn't worked. And any other engineers that would like to do that, the more the merrier. We'd like the input. Yes, sir.
Just one of my concerns is too, you're talking about drainage and all this stuff, is pervious cover, right? Because that would help me pull my costs down at what I feel, or, you know, but it also is, to me, helping the environment too.
Yeah.
That hasn't been the options in the past. I'd like to see that as some of the options, because again, I'm in an environmentally sensitive area where if I were to keep that water, you know, it's only going to help.
Well, the city's parking lot there behind Gracie's, that's, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Trey, but that's one of our first installations with pervious, correct?
Yes.
And I think everybody's okay with that parking lot, so.
The city's tested with it, it just hadn't been put into codes where we can use it for.
Yeah.
Yeah, and get relief from it. That's good.
And there's also been conversations about not all driveways have to be asphalt, you know, so.
Also kind of ties in with the drainage issue as well, but also the design standards, having options for different types of curbing. I think y'all allow currently lay-down curb, 6-inch standard 6-inch curb and gutter sections, ribbon curb, you know, roadside ditch. To still have those options available allows some flexibility, and also flexibility in design as well with regard to possible drainage issues that we may encounter from time to time.
Well, and back on drainage, I'm a big fan of regional detention, but part of our problem downtown is I don't have a lot of spots to put regional detention. So, you know, that becomes by definition something that could be incorporated as we move out from the central area. But we do have, there are a few soccer fields and baseball fields, and, you know, we'll do that where we can. But honest to God, all the little bitty ponds that, not the people in this room, but some people don't maintain, that ends up falling back on us, and it becomes the weak link in the drainage infrastructure if they're not maintained. So that regional detention is absolutely something else that we would take a look at.
I think with regards to infill, if there could be a separate section of the code that would specifically address infill versus it being categorized under any subdivision or plating process. In Austin, if you go and take a 2-acre tract infill and replat, you're going through the same process as if you're doing a 100-acre tract. And then, in other cities, they've expedited that process where certain requirements are not regulated as heavily with regards to detention or water quality because of the fact you have this tract that's already there, 2 acres, that has, you know, say 45% impervious cover as is, and just because you're replatting, now you have to, a third of that has to be detention, and you have the same impervious cover with replat.
If you do it in downtown Bastrop, you don't have any place to go with that detention. You can't detain because it's
Yeah.
all flat.
Right.
You can't outfall it.
And as long as your impervious cover and your FARs are staying the same,
Right.
it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I think, sometimes to take a year and a half to go through these detention processes.
Well, and to your point, we know that we've got infill, so it would make, instead of ignoring it and pretending it's other things, just have a specific section for it. I think that's a good idea.
So I agree, and I think part of the problem is instead of a lot of the infill stuff is the work that has to be done as far as the plat, like we're doing for the moratorium now, is that would require some geotech, what the soil looks like. And then you write all that down, but nobody wants to spend that money right in front a lot of times on infill. Some people do, some people don't mind, but that's usually what happens. Somebody who thinks they're not a developer, you're splitting their lot off for 3 lots that own forever. So the way to do that would be sensitive.
That could be another thing where that we try to find a happy medium, because instead of you going through the entire process and it taking a long time, yes, you can expedite some time, but you're going to have to make an investment so that we know that what we're approving. Because I'll tell you, the uncomfortable position is the phone call of, I've lived in this house 20 years, and you, City of Bastrop, issued a building permit to John Q. Citizen, and now my house is flooding. And so if we don't have something in place to prevent those conversations, then we're not taking care of our citizens in our community like we should. And I don't think anybody wakes up and says, I'm going to build something and flood my neighbor, but we have to make sure that we look at the big picture from either, whether it's infill or new construction. And Mr. Peterson and Mayor Pro Tem are, yes. I mean, that's a hard conversation to have with someone, and I just would rather not have it.
So we're getting...
What topics have we not?
Well, what's great is we've been integrating future and current together, so we're actually reintegrating these. It's 5:16, and we've talked a lot about process. We haven't talked about parking at all, which I'm really surprised parking hasn't come up, and parking requirements. Yes, sir?
One thing about process.
Oh, process, yeah.
My experience is that words in the code book don't mean the same thing to everybody, but visual graphics do. That if you have a code change and you can show people what it really looks like three-dimensionally, it's far better for their acceptance than to be blindsided later by something they felt wasn't intended.
We agree with that specifically, and talked with Matt about, those design codes, that's pretty good sleeping material, but you can look at a picture and say, I don't like that, or yeah, that's all right, and the only difference in the picture is you're allowing some flexible setbacks, but if you read that in a paragraph, it's hard to visualize that. So that's one of the things that we had tasked Matt with, of these words will result in these kinds of pictures. Is that agreeable? So I think that's a great
They
suggestion.
need to be three-dimensional.
Yes, sir.
Two-dimensional doesn't work.
I was struck when you used the analogy of the garage and the 2.7-foot setback. I've processed that as I've sat here, and somebody somewhere thought that was quality.
Yeah.
But it isn't. But the picture solves the problem, because if I ride up and down the street and it looks good and it feels good, do we care if it's 2.7 or 5.8? But we get hung up sometimes in the words on the page as mandating quality, but we miss the point. And so the pictures are important, because we can agree on a picture, not necessarily what the words mean, because words matter.
You live in the picture.
That's right.
Yes,
The
sir.
point you made earlier about intent statements, having spent 6 years on the Board of Adjustment for the City of Austin, having to go through interpretation cases over and over again, intent statements are very important. Even though they have to be well-written and very clear so that we don't have fuzziness, they're critical for staff making the right decision on application of the code.
Thank you for clear. I'll make a note of that. That's important.
And I think that's what the engineers are looking for too, because otherwise you're looking for a needle in a haystack and you don't know what this round of staff, how they're going to interpret that. So, good point. Parking, can we shift over to parking? Not everybody at once.
Are there any apartment or commercial builders here? Mainly residential? That's why. Okay, but it's going to be a really important part of the conversation though, so hopefully we...
Particularly an issue downtown.
Yeah.
The old parts of Bastrop, and with, potential infill,
Right.
parts of town.
Well, in condo developments and alleyway type things, parking comes into play, but those are usually things that we work out in the planning stages. But in that regard, it is helpful to know what the city's expectations are as far as number of car spaces required per, unit, occupied unit.
Do you think that our current parking requirements are too high?
Afraid I'm not familiar
You don't
enough
know?
with the current.
The form-based code gave relief downtown in parking a lot.
Yeah, I'm more concerned about the oceans of parking lots that surround the community that are not, I don't think, the prettiest things ever. Yes, sir?
Parking in infill neighborhoods is very, very critical. If you reduce lot sizes and add secondary units with no parking, you get a lot more street parking that then becomes problematic for emergency vehicles to get down the streets. So if you're going to reduce parking requirements in residential infill, then make sure it's only applicable to streets that can carry parking on both sides.
It's interesting you bring that up. I sat through a seminar a couple of weeks ago in Corpus Christi, and they compensated with on-street parking, but the tenants who had garage parking parked on the street because it was more convenient to their front door than the parking that was designated to them. So that's really a two-edged sword. Not only do you create the parking, but the enforcement of that. Because I went looking for this because the comment that I wrote down is we have plenty of parking. It's just not where people want it to be. It's not in the front
at
door.
my front door.
Well, the other side of it is that if you have commercial adjacent to residential and you don't have adequate parking for that commercial, then it overflows into the neighborhood. And that makes the problem even worse. We have residential parking permits. Almost all of the core neighborhoods have it now.
Residential parking, the RPP.
Something like Leonard Street.
Yeah.
Any other process comments? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting, the pre-application process I've been doing now in regards to drainage. I think if the council is interested in reducing the risk for developers to come in, formalize a process to where at the concept plan level they come before the city and, get kind of check the temperature of the council beforehand. I know that process has worked really well in some other cities nearby.
Well, the pre-application process has really worked well, and we've talked about just making that a part of the process up front, and specifically drainage concerns, because there's been, sometimes that doesn't get looked at in a timely manner, and that's such a huge influence.
When I was thinking more too, kind of go back to the matrix conversation, if a builder or a developer could come in and say, here's what I think my matrix will be, and the council can say, maybe we want to see a little more of that or a little more there. We don't like necessarily what this park is because we think it's a little bit too close to a field plan or what have you. That kind of feedback as early on as possible is helpful.
It's pretty interesting. So you're talking about a concept plat at the preliminary stages going to council for review, and maybe it's an optional process or
An
something?
optional process, it's not even necessarily binding in a lot of cases, but it kind of gives the developer a better feel what to expect when it comes back to the council for the real
Are you
deal.
talking about for a rezoning? Or?
No, for like a plan development, we are talking about trying to get away from that, but anything that might
Like
require.
a classification or
I'm sorry?
site plan process?
He's talking about site plan.
But you're talking about a plat though, right? I mean, you're saying that a concept plat, like before doing a lot layout, your preliminary, your concept plan.
No, it would be after that. So it'd be
Okay.
like the
It'd be a concept plat.
right.
Okay, all right.
Do the rest of you think that's a good idea?
Well, can I move one step in front of that? So then the one thing that we talked about was, let's say as a developer, we're out, we find a 100-acre piece of property that could have multiple uses on it. And I just actually went through this in the town of Seguin, of all places, and I went in and scheduled a pre-development meeting where I had the assistant city manager, city engineer, director of finance, bio was there, public works, utilities, and engineering, planning. We all sat and they had designated one day a week where developers come in and either you have existing projects like ours, or we meet with Jerry, every other week, or new projects coming in. And so we were allotted 45 minutes to come in and lay out kind of just a bubble diagram, and went around the table and found out, feedback from everybody, yeah, you're going the right way, no, this will never work. So I came out of that meeting within an hour going, okay, well, the project's dead. But I knew exactly why, right? There was no mystery. Removed all that. So assuming that was a viable project, I would have a great head start to go forward and start the pre-application.
Well, and that also kept you from wasting a bunch of money.
That's right.
That's correct.
So who thinks it was a bad
To
idea?
clarify on what David's asking and talking about, he's really talking about, future land use plan, if you're looking going from ag into some kind of zoning or some kind of zoning case that is going to go in front of P&Z, that the council can thumb it up, thumb it down, looking at what you're doing, something that may be a reasonable change, but on a community basis, maybe a drastic change, or maybe some policy discussion related to it, related, your future land use map and your comprehensive plan is showing commercial, yet the piece is going to go residential, and so you come in and ask for, hey, are you willing to change your future land use plan and go with a different kind of zoning and future land use for a specific tract? Before you start investing a bunch of dollars in cutting CBD loose to go draw a pre-land plan, you do a basic concept plan and go, hey, we're going to be changing the zoning on this thing. Council, are you on board or are you not on board? And that's working well in the communities that do it when you need that zoning change, or the future land use plan change.
We suggest it now. There have been a couple of times that development has walked through the door that clearly we're not opposed to, but it's different. And so we have proposed some workshops for that. But I don't think it's a problem to make it optional. If you want to go shop it, that's certainly fine. For those that are willing to invest in that. Now, every shiny penny has the flip side of that. How do you feel about council inflicting their will on you before you spend any money and design your project the way they want it to be built? Because that may not very well be what you are interested in, but you're not in a position to argue because you haven't necessarily built it, know what the costs are, know why you can't do X or whatever. Doug, what were you?
I think that's why it needs to be optional. If you want the input, you're free to go do it.
Just don't make everybody
but
do it.
Not another trip to council.
I'm thinking that.
As pleasant as we are, as few times is better.
I like the idea of the matrix better in a ranking system because that gives you a very good idea where you are before you even started without having to go before a body, So instead of having, something run to council, we build this matrix that has, based off the intent statements, based off the geographical sensitivity of the plan and X, Y, Z. And if you check those marks, that should be a good indicator that you are leaning towards the right direction versus coming in and trying to barter, well, tit for tat, you do this and you save that tree, we'll get, so I like the way that we were leaning with that.
With the matrix?
Yes, ma'am.
Maybe I'm not understanding the presentation to council. It almost sounds as if that's a pre-development meeting just with city council. I've never been faced with what's being discussed.
No, it's like what Sean mentioned. It's Cedar Park does it. I think Leander does it now. It's just an opportunity, like the city manager mentioned, that if it's something that's different or unusual, and this all came about because there was a development out. It was a small development between a large subdivision with acre lots and half-acre lots, and then they had a small subdivision with 30-foot lots in it, and it got kind of approved earlier on in the process. Kind of got the thumbs up from council, but then when it came down to the actual vote, it was disproved. And I think that the developer thought that if they had that information earlier, they would have not drug it along and went down the process as far.
Is that like what is being described here? Is that what y'all are saying is more in line with your workshops or your pre-development meeting?
The pre-application meeting is more of the...
Well, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I was thinking when we call you guys and come in to have a pre-development meeting, we're not just meeting necessarily with just staff, but also people that want to have some eyes on a project and a complete understanding. So is that kind of the same thing?
Yeah. Unless staff has unless council has a turnover, you started in March,
right.
Council turns over, in June you find out the council doesn't want what you just said.
And staff probably didn't know it until council
And staff
publicly
didn't know it.
said,
Right.
because somebody called.
Yeah.
Because that's often when they decide they don't like something.
And
Well,
that's
that
usually what happens.
example earlier of the client spent $200,000 to only have counsel. It would have been wonderful to be able to go to counsel. We had gone to staff. Staff loved the project. They thought it was great.
In a situation like that, typically, by the time you get to an election, you know if there is a difference in values. And while we don't get involved, we will offer a cautionary tale that this is going to appear at council in the summer, and depending on who wins, I can't tell you whether or not politically this will pass. And we will be talking about that in-house, and we will just, for what it's worth, share that with you, because we owe that to you. Because at that point in time, if I get a whole new council, I don't know what the answer is going to be. But you do run that risk, and silly season's the same regardless of the zip code. Until you get through election, it's just, you don't know what you got.
Now, in Austin, you go through in this big city down the road, you go through this pre-development meeting, and really had this happen. We had two projects, they were just, with the engineer went in and said, how about this? And they said no, and we said, well, that's going to kill that, and this is the reaction. We're good, we killed one. So thank you for not being quite that negative on stuff. So, and then the second one they killed, and they said, yay, we killed two today.
Our hope is that the consistency in the rules that we come up with, that, we vet through you all and through the community, will provide such a framework that even the community and the development community can get behind it, and then it will be timeless, regardless of council changeover. The community can hold the council accountable as they enter in, understanding their codes and regulations. And that would be the overall, goal of this.
And that's really the intent of the regulations. We know we won't update them on a real regular basis, that these codes are going to well outlive my term and anybody that's sitting on council's term, but you guys are still going to be around, and the community is still going to live with the consequences of whatever rules we come up with. So we've got to have enough, like I said at the beginning, enough flexibility that if there's an unanticipated consequence that's dumb, we got to be able to back up from that, but we've got to have enough things in place with like this matrix that we're talking about. One of my goals, the city manager and I, because we both were fairly new there back in 2017, just really want to make it easy to do the right thing. The code's been written, the community's bought into the code, what you're bringing has a high number on the matrix. Politically, okay, community, you're getting what you asked for. It's really easy to do the right thing. And quite frankly, I want to make it where it's not easy to do the wrong thing. And it's not just I counted to 3 and it doesn't matter if it makes any sense or if it agrees with any of our existing rules. So that's why it's so important to have those rules.
And if it's by right, you won't be going to council.
Right. If we do what we're intending to do with the
So I don't have
codes.
wasted all this money and 6 months of effort to have it blow up.
Because you now have 3 votes against you. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Have y'all considered the amount of data that's necessary for permitting, from doing a small job at your house, like changing a closet out, all the way to doing a major office building, and the amount of information that's needed to get the permit for each one of those steps in the difficulty? We
are in the process
Mapping all that.
of, and it is, I won't be city manager probably when we're finished. The challenge is always the why. And so we spend a lot of time, why do we even ask? Why do we care? Does that matter? Is that a life safety question? And so that's a journey we are taking internally, and that's part of what Matt's overseeing, because I would say to you, we ask, in some cases, the wrong things, and we don't ask for some things that we really should, and then you're left scratching your head, why do we ask that? Well, it goes back to somewhere something broke, so that's why we ask for that. So I pledge to you that we're working on that. By the end of December, not only will we have updated our zoning ordinance, we will have updated our sign code, we will have adopted a much newer international building, engineering, electrical, mechanical code. And so part of what Matt and his team are working on is the time element. Having good checklists, good processes that don't change, you know what to expect, it's predictable. If you submit a quality, complete submittal, the response should be no-brainer. So that's our goal. But we are challenging the bureaucracy of our documentation.
Well, the other side of that graph is who is responsible for making sure?
Exactly.
Is it the owner? Is it the owner's consultant? Is it the inspector? Or is it the city staff's review process? Where does the responsibility for checking that item come up? Is it something that's needed in the building permit application? If not, it's done by the inspector. You don't have to ask for it.
Part of our challenge, honestly, will be including the owner, because 9 times out of 10, by the time it gets to my office and he's pissed, he doesn't know we've been talking for months.
Right.
So we just need to include him on the front end so there's some accountability to those that he's writing checks to. And I find that that keeps us all in that appropriate tug and pull.
Dynamic.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
I had a note that I forgot to mention earlier when we were talking about some of the design considerations. Masonry requirements. If that is something we can keep a little bit flexible, that would be very helpful. We have different types of products, just like we talked about before, different type of fields in multi-phase development that we may be going for from one particular area to the other. So not backing us into a corner with regard to specific masonry requirements.
Well, and there'll be materials in 3 years that don't exist now,
Well,
right? And it needs to not take an act of Congress to get those adopted and incorporated.
Well, that very much drives the look and feel of not just a community, but even areas of a development.
But we need to be respectful of the fact that, particularly with infill, there is a look about that community, and we need to blend into that look.
Because downtown brick stands out.
Correct.
The challenge for us is the whole question of affordability that the mayor raised earlier. It's now tied from an economic development standpoint to us. You know, we've got to be able to have a workforce to support our business community here, because business is going to go where the workers are. And we have a considerable amount of jobs that we export because they're not here. And the reason they're not here is because there's not housing to support the workers that would live there. So we're now to a place that we're willing to challenge those paradigms and challenge masonry from an expense. We're never going to challenge life safety where we compromise the inhabitant that lives there or the longevity of the house. But I live in a 108-year-old house with all the joys that go with that. And it's not brick, and it has withstood the test of time. So that's part of that filter we're internally having to do, just like 6-inch, 8-inch concrete streets and masonry. Why? Because somebody somewhere decided that that was quality. Well, okay, it's not a luxury now that we can afford, and you could argue quality from a different building material. So that's part of the internal journey we're having to take, is why do we have that? What are we trying to accomplish? And go back to the intent statement and then be smart. Because the variety of the building materials directly influence the price you're going to put on that structure. And we need affordable housing. I have 58% of my workforce that does not live in this community, either because they can't afford to or there isn't a house. And I have one young man that drives an hour and a half to work. You got to applaud his loyalty. But that's 3 hours a day he's not going to get back. I want him to be able to live here. So we're really internally trying to figure out the right answer to that question.
Very good to hear. Thank you.
Your workers as well, right? I mean, and honestly, I hate referring to it as affordable housing because you say affordable housing and that means 10 things to 10 people and 9 of them are not good. When I was little, it was just called a house. It was the house your parents could afford to live in, and it was a neighborhood, and it was home. And we all go through different stages of life. I was laughing about the millennials, but there's a point that you just don't want to take care of a 1-acre lot, and you don't need a huge house, and you want a smaller place to live. And I don't think you should have to justify
moving out of town
why you can't have all kinds of options. And again, circling back to the comment that I made at the beginning, I think there is a wider span of market demand of housing than there's ever been. Some people love a McMansion and want a McMansion and live in them and like them. And some people really just want a place that's not an apartment. Some people absolutely want an apartment. And I think there's a way to provide those options so that it satisfies a lot of things. And when you provide those options, then you have workforce housing, and you've checked a lot of boxes at the same time. So that's really what we're trying to do with these codes. What topic did we not talk about that you're like, I cannot believe we were there for 2 hours and they didn't ever bring up? God bless you. He does this just to make sure we're awake. You might, if you're listening to the council meeting, he's good for at least 2 sneezes, and we all go gesundheit. So, any topic that you were hoping we would bring up? Yes, sir.
Might have missed this, but water quality. You all have water quality standards here, and what I'm not familiar with that, but in Bastrop, but as you mentioned earlier, the bigger city down the road have quite strict and black and white.
So talk about those. What have they gone too far? What becomes ridiculous, and what's reasonable?
Well, I think up to the 2-year storm that the city of Austin requires treating for water quality purposes, and they have multiple different means and methods of treating that they have. So there's rain gardens that are more aesthetically pleasing along pedestrian walkways that are implemented, or along streets of residential neighborhoods that are kind of below grade, set in stone, areas that can kind of capture that water and let it infiltrate over a 72-hour period, I believe. But I just was wondering what are some methods that y'all currently implement, because they have rain gardens, they have sedimentation filtration.
We have not reached the population where we're mandated to do that yet.
Okay.
And we don't.
But I will tell you that we're going to do drainage standards. We're going to then work on our floodplain regulations, and then we'll move to water quality. The challenge for us, and we may be equally as restrictive as the big city up the street, because here's why. We rely on the Colorado River for our drinking water. And so we have a responsibility to take as good a care of our neighbors to the south as we've treated it coming up. So I've been very proud of the council. We're in the process of designing a new wastewater treatment plant under an old permit. And council was very adamant that even though we had an old permit, we will treat our water to the new permit standards, so that when it's discharged and goes to Smithfield or Columbia or LaGrange, that water quality is there. We're going to be reasonable about it. We're going to figure out where low-impact development standards work. They make sense. An argument that we've come to understand to let you have granite driveways instead of asphalt is that will filter the water. Bar ditches filter the water, and they're cheaper than storm drains. So there's a lot of things that, necessity is the mother of all invention. And we've got a flooding problem in Bastrop. So we are now forced to peel back every assumption we've ever had about everything we think and figure out the smartest way to do it. So we're not there yet, but with all things, we're going to take a common sense approach, but we're going to be environmentally sensitive because we drink that water.
I guess, one specific example, there was a project we were working on that we were trying to do a correction to get a children's playground in a church. And one of the materials that was wanted to be used by the church was to have the synthetic lawn with the sub-base material that actually, I mean, it was all limestone underneath, like the rock underneath the development. So there is no infiltration. I mean, that water just runs off. So being able to have that base material and allow that water to kind of sit for a while and then drain off made sense in our mind, but they were focused on the fact that, oh, it's synthetic material. It's got, rubber beads in the lawn itself, and then the grass is not real. It's made of synthetics. And so they were not considering it, or they considered it to have to be treated by means of water quality. It was just kind of interesting. So there's ambiguity in the code. I think when you're requiring different aspects of a site to be treated, I think it's important, like we said, that the intent messages to be very clear on what you view as something that would need to be treated, that would be harmful, viewed as harmful and would need to be treated by means of water quality. I understand you're getting there, like not gotta keep the water from flooding first before you can worry about treatment.
Thank you. But you raised a good point, is let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, because you said that, and I can read the headline now, City Prevents Children's Playground.
At church.
Yeah, at church, that's the insult to injury right there, so, common sense really matters.
I said, hey, just let the kids play, they're just trying to get out there and have a good time. But, we ended up working it out by means that we had room in our existing water quality pond that we accounted for. But, there was enough ambiguity there that it became difficult and time consuming to get the correction approved. So, I think, minimizing ambiguity and maximizing clarity and intent is very important.
We'll be working on those intent statements, and they'll be bringing them to, we'll have some reviews of those and get some input, and be interesting because, you just have to be a lawyer to know that a sentence with 20 words means 10 things to 10 people, but we'll be working on that. Yes, sir.
Has staff kept a record or a list of all of the ambiguous elements of the code that they've had problems with over the years?
Sir, they're in enough paper.
That's right. That would be the code.
I mean, seriously.
City of Austin didn't do that.
Our code is so cumbersome that there should be sections with explanations, and you got to go to the definitions. We're not going to rewrite our codes. We're just going to throw it in the garbage and start over.
Well, knowing what problems were encountered in the past may prevent you from encountering them in the future.
Yes.
Well, and Matt made the comment that it's like, oh, there's a new rule about blah, 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 and somebody would pick up 3 paragraphs, shove it into the middle of our code, and not worry about whether it was conflicted with something else, if it was tied with something else. So it's really been a patchwork, and it's quite a nightmare to interpret.
We can stay after to answer any questions.
Yes, but we'll be respectful of time. I know there's a Campo meeting, and somebody may be
That's what I was
headed to
going to
that.
say to you. Campo is doing a regional arterial plan open house at our public library, so any of you develop here and are interested in regional transportation, you may want to attend that, but it's an open house from 4 to 7 at our public library. So,
and it was set up as a come and go, so I'm heading over it that way.
but staff will be here, answer any questions we didn't, and we cannot say thank you enough for giving up 3.5 hours of your time today to come participate in this process.
I want to thank y'all for the
Genuinely.
opportunity for us to share our thoughts.
Yeah.